I'm going to go ahead and start. There are some other people registered. They'll probably come in. There are plenty of seats. Not to worry, I don't think they should bother. And before I forget, because I'm likely to forget, we are recording this session, but none of the audience is included. It's just up here, so you don't have to worry about that, but it will be available if you want to refresh yourself on anything that Gabrielle says here today. So a special welcome to everyone today. We are celebrating the library's 100th anniversary this year and invite you to pick up a copy of The Town of Lewisburg Celebrates Thomas Balch Library's 100 years. It's back there. Copies of the Balch column listing the library's programs, classes, tours, and exhibits is on the table in the back of the room, along with other informative literature about the library and the Friends. Events are posted to our website and on social media. The fall newsletter, as well as back issues, may be read in its entirety on our website. For those who don't know, the water fountain is out the door to your left. The restrooms are straight back. If you have any electronic device, please turn off or mute at this time. And then masks are not required. If anyone would like to have one, please let me know. We are happy to provide masks. They're on the table in the back. Sorry. It is my pleasure, and it really is my pleasure to welcome our guest speaker today, Gabrielle Sanchez, who received her BA in History from Vermont, spent her junior year abroad at the University of Edinburgh, and holds an MA in History and an MLS from Indiana University. She has worked for many prestigious organizations, including the Library of Congress, George Washington University, the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen, and the New York Historical Society. A contract archivist, she's working at the Smithsonian Institution and is a former library reference associate here at Thomas Balch Library. Gabrielle will introduce you to the basics of preservation and discuss the best ways to house and protect personal archives. Please welcome Gabrielle.
I have a little handout for everybody before we get started. All right, so as Alexander said, my name is Gabrielle Sanchez. I'm a contract archivist for the National Anthropological Archives, which is part of the Department of Anthropology at the National Museum of Natural History at the Smithsonian Institution. I've worked as an archivist librarian for about 18 years, and today I'm going to be talking about the tools and techniques and methodologies that archivists use to preserve the items in their collections and how you can use those with your own home archives and family collections. So today, I'm going to be limiting my discussion to paper, books, or bound paper, and photographs. Usually I like the whole question to the end, but since there's kind of a small group, you can interrupt me as I go and we can have more of a conversation, that's fine. What we're not going to have time to talk about today is audio-visual recording, so your old home movies, audio cassettes, VHS, things like that. Digital media, and that includes both born digital materials like digital photographs or emails, things like that, as well as digitized materials, so scans and things of that nature. Disaster recovery, which is what happens if you have a fire or a flood. And complex conservation. If you have questions about any of these things at the end, I'm happy to sort of point you in the right direction, give you like a quick overview, but it's not something I'm going to be talking about in a lot of detail today. So before we sort of get into it, I have a few sort of overarching ideas and themes that to sort of frame our discussion. And then the first is conservation versus preservation. So I said we're going to be talking about complex conservation, conservation and preservation that kind of sound the same. Sometimes they're used interchangeably, but they do mean different things. So we talk about preservation, we're talking about the steps that we're going to take to ensure that our materials are maintained in their present condition or as close to it as possible. There's always going to be normal wear and tear, but we want to keep things as close to the way that they are now for the future. And so basically we're talking about storage and handling, and that's preservation. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. Conservation, on the other hand, is repairs. So that's taking something that has been damaged in some way and trying to restore it to its prior condition. And that is something that is not what I do. I'm not a conservator. Conservators are the whole separate profession. They are chemists, they are artists, they're amazing people. And I'm not a conservator, and I really can't provide a lot of detailed conservation guidance for you. And part of the reason for that is our second idea, which is do no harm. And I mean, this seems pretty intuitive. Like, obviously, we don't want to harm our collections. That's not what we're here for. But you would be surprised, and a lot of times people will take steps and do things that in the short term seems like a good idea, but are going to cause long-term damage. And so whenever you're thinking about taking a preservation action, you want to think, is this something that can be reversed? Meaning, can somebody in the future come back and undo what I've done, which is what you want? You don't want to make a permanent change. And is it something that is going to cause damage down the road, even if in the short term it seems like a quick fix? And I'll talk about some examples of that as we get into the talk. And then the third idea, which is probably the most important in terms of conceptualizing how to approach preservation, is the idea of intrinsic versus informational value. So when we talk about our our items in our collections, whether that's a document like a birth certificate or something like correspondence or photographs or whatever it is, these things all have informational value. So there's the data that's contained, in your documentation. There's the visual data that's in your photograph, and that's important, right? Because we want that information. But what we're also interested in, especially for me as an archivist, I'm interested in the object itself as a carrier of that information, and so I'm interested in the value of that object, almost somewhat distinct from the information itself. And when we talk about preservation, we're talking about preserving objects, which as carriers of this information, but preserving the object itself. So I'll give you an example so we can kind of think this through. If we pretend we're all librarians, right, and we have in our collection 3 copies of A Tale of Two Cities, and one is a first edition inscribed by Charles Dickens, and one is a Penguin paperback, and the third is an ebook, which I guess you can't really see by the bottom screen. The informational value of these things is the same. Now, yes, there may be some differences in the first edition from other editions, but for the sake of argument, let's say the informational value is the same, right? It's the same story. But the intrinsic value of these items is really, really different. Now, the ebook is not a tangible object, and so it really doesn't have any intrinsic value, right? It's just zeros and ones. We don't need to worry about that. But for our 2 things that we can hold in our hand, the value of those objects is very, very different. And so if we got a tear, say, in the cover of our first edition and our paperback, if we're the librarian, we're in charge of this collection, we're probably going to treat that very differently, right? Because the paperback we can replace, right? It's going to cost us, $15-20 maybe nowadays, and we'll probably, deaccession it, throw it in the trash, throw it in the book sale pile, who knows, depending on how bad, shape it's in, and what our policies are, and we're just going to order a new one. And we're probably not going to do that with our first edition, right? You could order a new one. I mean, not a new one, but another copy. But you're probably not going to just throw it in the trash. You're probably going to take some steps, and you can do a number of things. It probably shouldn't be in circulation, but if it was, you want to remove from circulation. You may close it temporarily while you're sort of deciding what to do with it or gathering money to fix it. You may put it in a special, box or enclosure to protect it. You may have a conservator come and fix it, right? There are a lot of different things you can do and steps you can take depending on how much money and how much time you want to spend to take care of it. So when we think about intrinsic value, what type of value? How do we determine that, right? What kinds of value are there? And when we think about value, the first thing we think about is money, right? And so you can buy a first edition of A Tale of Two Cities online if you go online, between maybe $2,000 to $10,000, depending on the quality and the condition of the book itself. And that's considerably more than our paperback, even though the story is the same, right? However, there can be worth more. So in 2019, there was a copy of A Tale of Two Cities that was inscribed by Charles Dickens to someone named Mrs. Cowden Clark, who was obviously a contemporary of Dickens, who was famous in her own time, but is maybe forgotten now. I don't know if anybody's really too familiar with Mrs. Clark, but this was sold in London for the equivalent of $137,000 in 2019. Right, because it has the value of association, because Charles Dickens himself handled it. I think it also had a letter in it, and this is like a picture of the letter. And he handled it, he gave it to this other prominent person. It has value because of that association with those 2 people. In 2014, a copy of A Tale of Two Cities inscribed by Dickens to George Eliot was offered for sale at Sotheby's for $350,000. So obviously we all know who George Eliot is, right? And so the value of that association is even more. So that's something to think about. So there's monetary value, which is one thing. There's this value of association, which is another thing. Something can have value just because it's super old, right? Its age, its rarity, or its uniqueness, right? It's a one-of-a-kind thing, you want to preserve it. It can have an aesthetic value. If it's just a beautiful thing, you want to preserve that. There's research value, which for me professionally is probably the most important value, because I'm interested in whether researchers are interested in this item and whether they're going to come to my repository to look for it, which are like two related but very different questions. And then the last value, which is probably the most important when we're talking about our personal family historical collections, is sentimental value. Pictures of your grandmother are going to be worth more to you than they are to me, and that's okay. And that's something that you need to sort of factor in when you're making your decisions. And that's a perfectly valid type of value. Not everything is going to be worth money that we have, but we still want to preserve it, right? Okay. So I'm going to start talking about the different formats. And for each format, I have like a very brief sort of historical overview, and then talk about sort of like the common problems that you may encounter, and the storage and handling. So paper. Paper was invented in China in the 3rd century and came to Europe in like the 14th to 15th centuries. Originally, paper was made from cotton, linen, or hemp. Rag, made from rag paper, literally made from rags. And these were, collected, they were sort of like shredded up and mixed with water and other things, and spread out onto a screen. And you can see the picture. Over this box called the decal box. And if you've ever made homemade paper sort of as a craft project, you may be sort of familiar with how this works. So it's the same process. And if you've ever seen like an old book that has sort of like the edges of the pages are kind of uneven, or sometimes you find like a new book that's like sort of hardcover, something that's like a tome, where they want it to look really serious, and they do that same thing with the edges of the paper are uneven. That's called the decal edge, and what they're sort of recreating, or if it's an older thing, what it actually is it's the edges of this decal box were uneven because it was sort of spread out, and they didn't always cut the edges straight to make it nice and tidy. So that's what that is. Modern paper, as we know, is made from trees, and trees have a substance within their cells called lignin, and you may have heard the terms or seen the terms like lignin-free when you're looking at archival supplies. And lignin is what makes paper acidic. It makes it become brittle and fragile and turn yellow and brown and crack over time. And so the older papers, the rag papers, don't have this because it's just not in the materials that they're made out of, those sorts of plant fibers, but it is in trees. And so older papers are not going to become brittle and fragile and break in the same way that modern paper does. So if you have, in front of you, all things being equal under ideal conditions, a document from 1720 and one from 1920, the one from 1720 is going to be more flexible, look better, easier to handle than the one from 1920 because it's made out of a different kind of paper, and modern paper is the paper that is acidic. So modern paper is made in these big long sheets, and this hasn't changed very much over the years how the paper is made post-industrialization. So when you make a book, what you do is, whether it's those sort of sheets of paper or big rolls, they print the text, and then it gets folded into bundles called signatures. And if you've heard the term like folio or quarto or octavo, that is the number of folds in the signature that they use. So octavo makes 8 sheets of paper, folio is 2. And then those are sewn together and encased in a binding, right? And we have an example here, and I can pass this around, of a book, and this book is from 1820 something, and you can see it's like not brittle, it's not fragile, right? You can flip through it, it's missing the cover, and that's okay. And you can see, if you look at it, At the bottom, there are these little, the page numbers are up here, and at the bottom, there are these alphanumeric designations. This one says H2. Those are the signature markings. So the signatures were all lettered, and that was how the person who sewed the book together knew what order to put the signatures together. So you can take a look at that. And of course, modern books are made in the same way, except they're usually glued together. And the signatures, I don't know if they call them signatures in a modern book, but the bundles are much, have a lot more sheets of them, right? Okay, and then, so traditionally, prior to industrialization, your printer and your bookbinder are two different people. Like now you buy a book and the publisher designs the cover and sells you the whole thing in one package. But, way back when, before modern printing and industrialization, all those things, your printer was one profession and bookbinding was a separate profession. So if you're a wealthy person, you're buying new books, you buy the book from the printer and you take it to the bookbinder, and the bookbinder will bind your book according to, whatever you choose. So you can choose your own cover, what color you want it, what color you want the embossing to be, what color you want the end papers to be. You can make all of those decisions. So when you think of sort of like an old world library where all the books are like leather bound and it all matches, it's because the people would have had the books bound to match so that, it looks nice. And it also means that if you find, you can have two copies of a book printed at the same time, but the bindings can be very, very different because it depends, the person who printed the book is not the same as the person who bound the book. So we talked about acidic paper, right, which is what we're all, we're all pretty familiar with this, and this is a natural process. There's nothing really that can be done to stop this. Paper itself has these acidic compounds in them, and they break down over time, and it's like an oxidation process, and it's just what happens. One thing you want to do is make sure if you have anything, say letters that are in envelopes, things like that, you want to make sure you unfold everything if you can. If you unfold things, that it becomes weak along the crease, and that's going to cause that area to be more susceptible to breakage, right? So if you have a collection of letters, take them out of the envelopes, unfold them, documents, you want to generally store things flat. What we don't want to do is laminate things. And this is an example where the principle of do no harm comes in. Lamination was invented around the 1930s and originally was conceived as a really wonderful way to preserve documents. It sort of encases them in plastic with, it's like a heat and glue process in this plastic, and everybody thought it was fantastic. And the Library of Congress's copy of the Emancipation Proclamation was laminated. Where I work at the National Anthropological Archives, we have Sitting Bull's pictorial autobiography. It has pictures of the Battle of Bighorn that Sitting Bull drove, laminated. And like the curator of North American Ethnology says, you could use them as placemats. And it's really a tragedy. It can be undone. It's not always successful. The one at the Library of Congress is actually did delaminate it, and it's now lives in this special chamber because it can't be exposed to like the air. So starting in the 80s, lamination kind of fell out of favor, but by that point, a lot of damage had been done. So you don't really want to laminate your documents. As I said, it involves, it's heat, it's glue, and plastic, and you can't really undo it. And it kind of accelerates the natural sort of degradation process that's going to happen to your documents anyway. Instead of preserving them, it in fact speeds it up. Tape. So, you have something in two parts, think, I'll just tape this together. Also not the best idea. What will happen is eventually the tape will lose its tackiness and fall off. It will stain your document, and so you still have your document in two pieces, but now it's permanently stained and maybe has some residue and other things on it. So we want to avoid using any sort of tape. And if you find tape in your documents, if it's already like coming loose a little bit, you can remove it. If it's still tacky, I would leave it there. Eventually, it will come off. And here are pictures of long-term damage. Tape. Metal. So metal rusts. So you want to remove all fasteners, and that includes paper clips, staples, binder clips, brads, brackets, straight pins, people used to use for documents. All of those things can rust, and it leaves this really unpleasant, dirty mess all over everything. And the other thing is rubber bands that can become very sticky and stuck to your materials over time. And I actually we have a whole folder here of rubber bands of doom. It's labeled. So here you can take a look at some sticky rubber bands. So you want to remove those when you can. So I said you want to remove your staples, but how do you do it safely? I think we've all had the experience of using kind of an office staple remover, and it takes out like a whole chunk of the paper with it, right? I do this every time I try to use one of those. So you don't want to use that. What you want to use is down here. Let me away. Is one of these, which is a spatula. It's called a spatula, and I've got this little GIF here of in action of how to remove a staple. So you take your piece of paper with your staple, you flip it upside down, you take it from the staple end, right? And you lift one side up and the other, and then you pull the staple straight out. And that way you're left with only the two holes without damaging the paper up underneath. So here's, you can take a look at this spatula. You can also use that for removing tape. So you're saying to yourself, well, if I take away all my, my staples, my paper clips, and all this sort of stuff, how do I keep my papers together, right? So you have three options. One is to replace your old rusty paper clip with a stainless steel or a plastic paper clip. And so what you want to do is put a piece of acid-free paper, like here, and put the clip over the paper so the clip's not directly on the documents, and that protects a little bit. You could also use a sheet of polyester film, Mylar, and you could do this. I generally don't really like the paper clips. I mean, they're perfectly fine. Like, people use them, it's okay. It kind of makes your collection really bulky, and if you have a folder that has a lot of them in it, what'll happen is you have like one corner where it's like really thick, and then it's not going to sit right in the box because one side is going to be super thick and the other side is going to be, and then you can kind of like get fancy and kind of move them all around. It's kind of messy. I don't personally like it, but it's fine. You could totally, it's totally legitimate if you do. Then the other thing to do, which is what I would prefer, is you could take a sheet of acid-free paper and make a little, and fold it in half, and you put your documents inside, and then it keeps it all together, and then you have the benefit of being able to write on there what exactly it is, like, letter from, Uncle Gabe to Aunt Sue. You can write the date, you can say, whatever's in there, how many pages it is, so that way you know what was in there, things won't get lost. The disadvantage of this is that acid-free paper is really expensive. And if you have a limited space, if you do this a lot, it will also kind of bulk up your collection because you're adding a lot of extraneous papers in there. And so another example of fax paper or any sort of like thermal printing, over time the ink fades and you can see what was written in like pen is still there and legible, but the other, the words that were printed or you can't really see them, they faded. So if you have like faxes, I don't know how many really important faxes people have, but if you have anything that's like this, you want to make a copy to preserve the information because eventually it will disappear. I think I may have a copy of that in here somewhere, but I don't know. All right, so once you have your paper and you've unfolded everything, you have it organized however you want, which is not something we're talking about today. You want to use, put it in sleeves if you have them, in folders and in boxes. These are the kind of boxes that we use. And these are, let's see, the folder, I guess you saw the folder when I passed the rubber bands around. When you're buying supplies, you generally want to buy from a library or archive supplier. There's no regulation of the terms archival or acid-free or, lignin-free or any of these things, So when I would buy, and I have it there on the sheet, and I'll talk about more at the end, but you want to generally go to a reputable supplier that also sells to libraries and archives. I can tell you that when I was at the Library of Congress, they do one order every year for the entire library for supplies, which is pretty intense. And 1 year, and then they do their own testing. So they get the stuff, they're buying, thousands upon thousands of boxes and folders and sheets of Mylar, and they send it to their lab. And 1 year, all the Mylar failed the testing. And there was no Mylar in the entire Library of Congress for 6 months. And so if that is happening with stuff that's being sent, where they know they're testing it, they're sending it to the Library of Congress, and it's still not passing inspection, I wouldn't be shopping in Michael's for my archival supplies. You want to do yourself a favor and buy from, reputable companies and hope for the best, I guess. So when you put your folders in your box, it's really important. The folders generally have a crease on the bottom. Use the crease. A lot of times people don't fold the crease at the bottom, if you know what I'm talking about. And you want to, sometimes it has one crease, sometimes it has 5 creases. I kind of like those with 5 creases because you get it exactly to your, the depth of your materials in there. And what happens is if you don't put them in there straight, over time, there's this tectonic plate action where some of the folders get subsumed under the other ones and then everything's folded and crinkled in your box. And you really don't want that to happen. So you want to make sure your folders are neat, they're all standing up straight. That's what the crease is for, to have everything in there. You don't want your folders overstuffed, you don't want them understuffed, you want them exactly filled to the crease in the box, if possible. If you don't have enough room in your box, you can use spacers. Where I am at the National Anthropological Archive, some madman, here, I'm gonna move this because this just is so galling. Maybe I can't, it's here. Put all these spacers, I don't know when this happened, 20, 30 years ago, but they put the spacers in backwards for thousands of boxes. That doesn't help, right? The stuff's all bent, right? You gotta put the spacers so that it's flat and holding it up, right? So make sure that your materials are standing up straight, not being warped and bent in the box. It's really important because it's gonna live in that box for, a very long time. Okay. Now, when you're removing a book from a shelf, everybody's instinct is to just, the no, is to grab it like this, right? You don't really want to do that. Because over time, what will happen is you'll wear you'll wear this part away and it'll cause damage. And there are some books I've seen them up here in the Balch Library, if you go look on the shelves, that you can see where that has happened to the books. Maybe you don't see it so much in your public library because the books change so frequently, the collections are switched out, but in a library that has older books that have been there for a very long time, you will see it. So what you want to do is you want to identify the book that you want, you take 2 fingers, you push the other books that are next to it in, and then remove the book like this. That way you're helping to preserve the binding. So, you can have books, that look like this that are missing, the binding or have other issues. And you can call a conservator and they can put a new binding on there. That's very expensive and you really need to think about whether that's something you want to do. Generally, what you want to do is have them in a little box like this. It's called a phase box, and you can buy a kit. So you can make these yourself, and you just measure your book, and it comes with the little Velcro nubbins on there, and it fits your book rather. Here. And it can protect it. That works. And then here are some examples too of some professionally made, you can go to a bookbinder and they can make these for you if you have something that's really important, but I don't know that most people, do this. It's very expensive also. It's sort of the most important thing in your collection. You might do something like that. And you can also, if you don't use the Velcro, you can also use this one is linen tape. You can use to tape up the your little package. So you want to also, it's really important to shelve books properly. Books are designed to stand up. They want to stand up like books. They don't want to be on their sides. They don't want to be upside down. If you have to put books in boxes, And they have to be, you generally want them to be like this, which nobody wants to do because then you can't read the spine, right? But what's gonna happen is if you put it in this way, which is what everybody's instinct is, so you can see what it is, eventually the weight of the text block will pull it out and it will separate and you'll break your book. So if you have to store a book in a box and you can't do it upright, you want to do it like this with the pages facing out. So coming back to some of our, we were talking about earlier with preservation versus conservation and how to decide how much to do. So here's an example of, this is a ledger book from a company, and they had a warehouse fire at some point, presumably in like the 19th century, right? And there's a big fire, it's a big event in the you know, the history of this company. And this book was damaged, and you can see the fire damage, right? And so you could take this book and you could have it conserved, right? You could, somebody could come and fix the cover and they can make it look beautiful and like new. And they're not gonna be able to replace the information that was lost in the pages, obviously, but they could fix those pages and make them, you know, they could put like blank paper, basically, they put like a blank paper in there so it would still be a full sheet of paper. And you could do all that. But this, as an object that has this burn in it, kind of tells the story of this organization, right? That this organization did have this fire and there were things that were lost. And this is an artifact of that experience. So when you're thinking about, you know, preservation and conservation, the goal is not always to return something to its original, most pristine state, right? You want to think about what exactly you're trying to preserve. And in this case, it makes a lot more sense to preserve the evidence of this fire. So that's just something to think about. So rolled and oversized items. So if generally, if you have something that's rolled, whether it's like a big map or posters or photographs are a little bit different, but paper that's rolled, you want to store it flat if you can. So if it's pretty, if you can unroll it and it's not fragile and falling apart and cracking, you can unroll it. You can weight it down. What you could do is maybe put something under it, like, you know, some like folders, and you can use like a big dictionary or a phone book if you have one, something like that, and you can weight it down until it's flat and you can put it in a big folder. I don't know if you necessarily have a mat case in your house to put a big folder, but you could put it in a big folder, and that's you know how we would try to store it. If you don't have the ability to store it flat, because you know most people don't have a big old mat case in their house, you can roll it. What you want to do is you can get an acid-free tube. And instead of, it's not a mailing tube, so you don't shove the item inside the tube, you roll it on the outside of the tube. So the tube is there to provide structure, and you roll it on the outside of the tube like this, and then you can wrap it up in like an acid-free tissue, or they make like a heavier kind of paper that you could use to wrap the whole thing up to protect it. And if it's fairly flexible and it's not in danger of kind of cracking and falling apart, that's a good way to store it. You could try this humidification process. Now, I've never done this, and this makes me incredibly nervous, but I'm going to tell you about it anyway, because it's a totally valid thing to do, but you got to be really, really careful. So what you do is you get yourself like a bin, like one of these underbed bins, and some sort of piece of like a plastic, you know, like a grating, right? And you get like a wet towel. And you put the damp, not wet, damp. And you put the towel on the bottom, you put the grate on top, and you put your rolled item on top of the grate. So that it's never touching the moisture, right? And then you cover it up. And this is not the kind of thing you set up and then like go on vacation for 2 weeks, right? You gotta check on this, right? So you check on it, and like, obviously you're introducing moisture and that can introduce mold, and you don't want to do that, so you gotta be really, really careful. But within a few days or so, it should loosen up a little bit, and you should be able to unroll it, and then you can roll it out flat and weight it down and without it cracking. So that's something you could try. Anything else? No. Okay. So newspapers. Newspapers are, especially clippings, are one category of material that archivists routinely photocopy and throw away the original. That is like a big no-no in archives, is throwing away the original, except when it comes to newspapers. Newspaper is ubiquitous. It's on exceedingly poor paper. It's highly acidic paper. It was meant to be an ephemeral item. There's usually copies of that information in multiple places. And it's just really hard to preserve and keep intact. If you have newspapers that you really want to keep, you can do that, that's fine. But if it's just a clipping or something like that, it is okay to just make a photocopy and throw away the original if you want. You could also, if you wanted, say, like, keep the clipping and interleave it between asset-free paper so it's not, sort of corrupting whatever's around it. If the other option is you can keep your newspapers. They make special size newspaper boxes. If you have like a newspaper, from when you were born or, whatever it is, or an important event, you want to keep it, that's fine. They do make boxes. You can layer it with tissue and preserve it, but it's going to it's not going to keep as well as some other types of paper. Did I skip the thing about mold? Did we talk about mold? Did I skip through that one? No, it's fine. Well, here's mold. Did I skip this? Was I like moving a box when I was I'm sorry. Because I was like, well, what are we talking about mold? Okay, so mold. So you don't want mold, right? This can happen. Mold can be dormant, or it can be active, or it could be dead, right? So if you see something and you suspect it's mold, the first thing you want to do is smell it. Don't do that. What you could do is if you take like a gloved finger and you kind of, touch it, if it smears, then it's active mold. If it's kind of dusty, it could be dormant, it could be dead, it could be dirt. If you suspect you have mold, you want to take it really seriously. Mold is the kind of thing where the more you're exposed to it, the more you become sensitized to it. When I was in grad school, there was a conservator at the university who had developed a real sensitivity to mold, and his name happened to be Jim Canary, and they called him the canary in the coal mine, because you could bring something, if you thought it was mold, because that happens a lot in your processing collection, you're like, I don't know what this is, what do you think, is it mold? You bring it to him, he would break out in a rash, like on site, if he was in the same room with it. That's not something you want. I mean, it's a professional asset for some, but for the rest of us, our health is more important. So if you think you have mold, I think the first thing you want to do is think to yourself, do I really want to keep this? Like, do I want to deal with this, or can I let this thing go? Because dealing with it can be very expensive. You want to segregate it. You can try to put it outside, like on a nice sunny day, and kind of air it out, and that can help. You can put it in a bag and put it in your freezer till you decide what to do with it. Just to sort of segregate it and make sure it doesn't contaminate anything else, and that will sort of stop the growth of the mold. And if you're determined to keep it, then you do need to have a professional come and deal with it. It's not a DIY project. All right. Did I say I didn't skip anything else, did I? Just that one. Okay. All right. Sorry about that. So photographs. Let me see if there's anything else in here to pass around for paper. They've got all sorts of goodies in here. Photos. Paper. Here's a laminated items. If anybody's interested. Those. And then, I don't know what the rest of this is. Okay.
So with newspapers,
Yeah.
it's already, it's gonna fall apart anyway.
Mm-hmm.
Laminating it, is that doing, it's not like it's necessarily gonna do any more damage. If you've taken a photocopy and then you just laminate the original for as long as it lasts, I guess.
It could. I think, there's no preservation police, they're gonna come, you know what I mean? And say and I've also had people ask questions about I have these documents that I consult frequently and I wanna laminate them, or I've laminated them, is that okay? It's yeah, that's fine. Just don't think you're doing a preservation activity to this item.
Yeah.
It's not like all lamination is bad, some things you have to laminate, your ID card, things like that are gonna be laminated and that's fine. What you're not doing is preserving it or extending its natural life. So, yeah, that's totally fine. Okay, so photographs. So photography, was invented in the 1820s, and there are a lot of different methods of making photographic images, and I'm not going to go into any sort of detail about the history of the photograph. The important thing to know is that a photograph is layers, right? So there's an emulsion layer that has your image, and then it's on a backing layer that can be metal, like a daguerreotype or a tintype. It can be glass, like a glass negative or a lantern slide. It can be film, like a negative, or like a 25mm color slide, something like that. It can be paper, which is maybe what we think of when we think of prints, right? So the damage, for preservation, we need to be concerned about both the image and the backing layer that it's on. We need to be concerned about preserving our images, right? And then really, the most important thing is labeling and making sure that we know what the pictures are of. Because if you have photographs and they don't have any context, they don't have a lot of information in most cases. And especially, we're talking about our family, family photos, like you may know who these people are, but that doesn't mean your kids are gonna know who they are or anything like that. And so you really lose a lot when you're not properly labeling your photographs. So I have some pictures here of different kinds of damage to photographs. This one is a negative with a big old thumbprint on it. I didn't talk about gloves when I talked about paper and books because you don't need to use gloves with paper and books. I don't know why anytime you watch a TV show about archives, they're always wearing gloves. This does not happen. We don't wear gloves when we handle paper and books. What gloves do is it makes you lose your dexterity, right? Especially cotton gloves, right? You're trying to handle some item and you got these bulky gloves on and you're just gonna end up tearing paper, right? Because you're clumsy. With photographs, you definitely want to use gloves because in this case, you can have the oils in your hands can leave marks and will over time permanently damage the emulsion in your photos. And then the other one is has some emulsion damage, generally caused by just storage issues and wear and tear. And then this is of course a very famous photograph, and that's the original glass negative that is cracked. So, I said labeling was really important. It is, but we don't necessarily want to label like this. What we want to use is, and I think we have some things around here. Oh, here are the faxes. Oh yeah, here. Here's a very fax in the presentation. How exciting. And so you can see it's all faded. A pencil. Maybe it's in here. I don't know what happened to the pencil, but I have a picture of the pencil. So you want to use these blue photo marking pencils. If you use like an ink pen, eventually on a print, eventually the ink will seep through the paper and you'll be able to see it in the on the image side. And even a regular pencil can be very hard. You can, the regular number 2 pencil, and it can leave an impression on the image. These pencils are very, very soft, which makes them incredibly difficult to write legibly with. By the way, you need to keep your pencil sharpener real handy. I don't know how they got them this sharp in this photo, to be perfectly honest with you. They're really hard. But it's more, if you're writing like names and stuff, it's fine. If you're writing with a long series of numbers, if it's like an ID number for a photo, that can be very hard. It's fine. So these are the kind of pencils you want to use to label your photographs. And then there's Mylar. So what Mylar does is, Mylar is a type of polyester film. Mylar is the brand name. Like Kleenex, it just was called Mylar, no matter who makes it. What this allows you to do is to handle your photos without using gloves, without worrying about damaging them, and it makes it easier to see everything. Mylar can be very, very expensive. And so you don't need to use it for everything. It doesn't have magical properties that preserve your photos. It just makes it easier for you to handle them. And it comes in a lot of different styles. So you can use it for prints and your slides, and you can have stereoscopes, and it comes in all different sizes. And they make these where it's like kind of could you go into binders, you can make like an album for them, and they make them so that it has a little if you wanted to label, like insert like a little label in them, you can do that too. You could write on it. If you have a lot of photos and you don't want to spend a fortune on Mylar, you can also use envelopes. Special envelopes made for photos or negatives. And then you can maybe separate the ones that you are sort of like the ones you want to look at the most, or the ones you want to bring out to show your family. But especially when we're talking about like older photos where you took the whole roll of film and maybe there's 3 really good photos on there, but you have like 20 like not so great photos because how are you supposed to know? You necessarily don't have to sleeve every single one of those. You can put those in an envelope, and that would be fine. Let's see, albums and scrapbooks. So a lot of times when I tell people I'm an archivist, they're like, oh, I love scrapbooking. I don't. Scrapbooks, I think like a lot of artists have a kind of love-hate relationship with scrapbooks because they can be great. They're little curated collections, and they can really tell a story, and they can be really beautiful and visually interesting, and they're the kind of thing like when you have visitors, you bring out the scrapbooks because people can look at them, and they're cool. From a preservation standpoint, they're very, very difficult. Because you're talking about a lot of different materials all in one format. So you can have, paper, and you can have a lot of sort of ephemeral paper like newsprint or ticket stubs and things like that, paper that wasn't meant to last for a long time. You can have photographs, you can have botanicals like pressed flowers, you can have things like human hair in there, all sorts of items. I once had a scrapbook that had like an entire pocket watch inside, like it doesn't close, and then you're talking about, and it's all in a book, so that's another format, right? So they can be very difficult. So here's another example of one that's in kind of sorry shape. So generally, what you want to do is, if it's in okay shape, you want to get yourself a box and you want to put it in the box, and you don't want to touch too much. That's really the best thing you can do with the scrapbook. If it's in really, really bad shape and falling apart, sometimes we do just fine scrapbooks. What you would do is you would take a picture of the scrapbook as it was originally, right? So you're preserving that, and then take it apart and store all the materials separately. We don't like to do that because we want to preserve the item, but sometimes you really can't. It's too much of a mess, and it's just going to get worse the longer it stays in there. So that is an option also. I would say that if you want to make scrapbooks, if you're into it as a hobby, that's fine. For a preservation perspective, the absolute best thing to do would be to make the copies of your photographs and things like that, and put the copies in the scrapbook and save the original somewhere else. But again, this is it's up to you. But preservation-wise, scrapbooks are not the best way to preserve your items. Then there's magnetic albums, and if you have these at home, you should go deal with them today. These are bad. These are real bad, and I think we have some examples of these too. So these were really popular for a while, and I think maybe they still sell them, but they, here we go. We have some examples of these. They're sticky. Everything turns brown in them if you have any at home. Their pages were white at one time, and they're no longer white, would be my guess. It's highly acidic. It's in this plastic that's not good plastic. I would take these apart as my first project if I had these. Sometimes they're still stuck. I found like 90% of the time I can just pull that piece of plastic back and take all the pictures out. But sometimes it's really stuck in there. If that's the case, you gotta leave it. Or get somebody to really deal with it. I would just leave it for a while. Eventually it will give up, and you can take it apart, but these are generally not great. So for now, we want to display our photos, our family photos, and whatever else in our home. And this is fine. But we have 2 concerns. One is the materials that we're using, right? Because we're sort of trapping our photograph or our document or whatever in this little container. And if we're using, like if there's like cardboard or sometimes there's newspaper in the back of like an older frame thing, and things like that. So we want to make sure we're using acid-free mats and all that kind of thing. And the other problem is light exposure. So you want to make sure you're not hanging something sort of in front of, a space that gets, 6 hours of light a day. Light exposure is something like museum people, like I work in a museum, but I'm not a museum person, but they take this really seriously. And we have this very small exhibit in the museum right now. I think it's still up, I don't know. It went up literally the week before everything shut down for the pandemic, and it was supposed to go for 2 years, so I don't know what's going on with it. But the conservation plan, because everything that goes on display, it's like, it's a short, it's supposed to be there for 2 years, temporary exhibit. So you have to work with a conservator, and the conservation plan they had to have 4 sets of every single item in the display cabinet so that they could rotate them, periodically so that nothing was on display for too long because of the light. And I know that we also have one item on display permanently in the museum, and somebody has to go downtown and turn the page every 3 months. So you want to think about light, and you can get UV protected glass and all of those things when you go to get things framed, but it's something to consider, and just make sure that you're not hanging things in a place that gets a lot of light, if possible. And then again, just like with the scrapbooks, if you're really serious about it, like the best thing to do would be to make a copy of your photo, put the copy in the frame, and save the actual photo somewhere else. But again, you don't have to necessarily do that, but from a preservation perspective, that would be the best thing. All right, so we know what we're gonna do. We're gonna set up our workspace. This is a lovely place to work, but it's like terrible for the kind of work we're gonna be doing. So you wanna have like no food or drink, no, candles and things like this, plants and flowers, anything that can, have like water. And you really don't want a cramped surface. You wanna be able to spread out, because things do get, damaged and folded and bent when you're, kind of working very tightly. So most people don't have a conference table in their house, I don't know, but you can definitely use a dining table as long as it's like, clean. And that way you can, sort of spread out and do all of your work and get everything organized and do your rehousing and everything like that. You wanna make sure your hands are clean, you don't wanna sort of lather up with a lot of like lotion right before you work, things like that. So tools and supplies, we talked about a lot of these already. So there's the spatulas. This thing is a bone folder, and you can use this to fold things. Basically, it just helps you make a really, really sharp crease. You can use it to make the creases on your folders, which is very satisfying. You can use it to make your phase boxes and other things like that. Anything that you want, sort of make it sort of like a creative, to make like a package for or anything like that. You want to use a good quality eraser. The magic rubber erasers are really good. They don't, sometimes you use an eraser and it makes more of a mess than when you started, right? These are good quality erasers. You want to always use pencil, not pen, not markers like where I am, some madman went and marked all the boxes in Sharpie at some point. I don't know what they were. Yeah, anyway. Pencil you want to use. These are like book weights, and you don't need these. Like I said, you can, if you have something you're trying to weigh down, you can definitely use like a, a folder and a book. These would come in handy if you have a book that's kind of fragile and you kind of want to hold it open. It's like a lighter weight like that, or you can get like kind of like a book snake kind of thing. Which you may not need those. There's magnifying glass, which can be super helpful, and a brush to brush off like dirt or your erasings and things like that, just to keep everything kind of clean and tidy. So the Balch has these preservation kits, and there's 2, which is what these boxes are here. And so there's like a regular one, kind of gives you a little sample of some of the supplies, so you can sort of see what they like, try it out. So they have one that has a legal size document box, which is, I don't know, I think you get this size, which is a 2.5-inch size document box. It's legal. And then it comes with 10 like folders, mylar sleeves, interleaving paper, the spatula, the photo marking pencil, which I can't find. I think there's one in here maybe. and an eraser and a pair of gloves. Oh, here we go. In the photo kit, we got a pencil. Yeah, so you get, there's the pencil. And then these are like cotton gloves that you could use for photos. You could also use like regular, like, like regular gloves like the nurses wear, that's fine too. So that's and then there's one that's for photos also that has more photo specific things. Oh yeah, that one comes with an assortment of mylar sleeves and silver safe paper, which is a special kind of paper that has a very low abrasive quality, so you could use it with, it won't damage the emulsion on your photos. It's good for things like if you have like tin types or things like that you're not gonna put in plastic. So your storage environment, so you need to like go and have some sort of climate controlled storage facility in your house. A normal sort of comfortable environment, like 70 degrees Fahrenheit, 55% humidity, basically what you would normally have in your house. And it's more important that your temperature and humidity remain constant than it be at a certain point. So you want to avoid attics and basements where it can get very hot or very cold seasonally. And you also want to avoid sources of heat and water. So, like in the basement next to your water heater is like not the best place to keep your stuff. And you also want to not have it directly on the floor in case there's any sort of flood. If it's in a boxes kind of, we've got moisture. You want to avoid direct sunlight and artificial lights as well. And, keep the area clean. So then I have these websites, and this is on the handouts, you don't need to write this down. But, so the National Archives and the Library of Congress both have websites that are geared towards the general public that have preservation information at a very basic, understandable level. Then there's the Northeast Document Conservation Center, which is an organization that that does work with libraries. They have a lot of technical leaflets on their website that are written they're written for sort of librarians or collection managers, but not necessarily for conservators or preservation specialists. So it's written for a library setting, but in language that's for for the general public really to understand. It's not really technical. The American Institute for Conservation of Historic and Artistic Works has two websites that I have here. One is sort of general. This one, Caring for Your Treasures, that one is for the general public, and that one not only goes into like the paper and photographs and things like that, but also things that I don't work with, like objects, furniture, architectural, like historic preservation. It has information about stuff like that, which sometimes people ask me about. I don't know. And then if you're really into conservation at a highly technical level, the Cool Conservation is like a website for conservators. So this is highly technical information, scientific studies and things like that. If that's your thing, you can go for it. Archival Methods has they sell products, but they have a blog that is written for the general public. I think they sell to libraries, but a lot of their stuff seems to be aimed towards more like like the general public, and their blog is definitely aimed towards the general public, and they have a lot of really good information there. I don't know anything about the quality of their products, but they have decent information. And then the last one is this Preservation Self-Assessment Collection ID Guide, which I actually use a lot. And this is sort of a website that helps you identify what you have, because sometimes you don't really know what it is. And it's not just paper, books, and photographs. It also has audiovisual materials and things like that. But if you're trying to look at something and you're like, is this a lithograph? Is this what is this? What made this? And it has like history of the process, so you can kind of date it. And then information about how to store it and things like that. And so it can be really helpful if you just are kind of clueless as to how to approach it because you don't even know what it is. And also it could be really helpful for like office, like copying things, like what process made this piece of paper, anyway. So, overall, are ideas, that we're gonna take home, do no harm, right? Thinking about the intrinsic versus the informational value and preserving the object as a carrier of information versus preserving the information itself, and thinking through really when we're interested in the information and when we're interested in the object, using acid-free products and properly included labeling things so that not only we can identify them, but so that people who come after us can also identify them. And that's it. So if anybody has any questions about anything, I'm happy to.
I have a question. When you were talking about books, you said that they are designed to be stood up.
Mhm.
So what is the damage or the danger of having them laid down?
That's a really good question. I think, well, for some books you do absolutely want to lay down, like an oversized book, like a very long, like a coffee table book, wants to. I think in general, structurally, they just want to be like this. I think, you can maybe.
I mean, I'm thinking like, I have some old books that look sort of like that.
Right, yeah.
And I do have them laying down because I just feel that they're safer that way.
Right, I think if it's damaged, I think laying it down is fine. I think generally, I'm not entirely sure what that would do to the binding over time to have them all like this. I just know that you really want to have them like this. I don't know. I'm sorry. Yeah, I hadn't really thought about it. You just definitely don't want to have them like this. I can tell you that much. I think that it probably, I don't know.
When you have, so I have some old photographs, I believe, they're photographs, really large. Do they make those kind of folders for, I've seen like the large map ones, but is there like a middle size for?
Yes, they come in all sorts of different sizes.
Oh, okay.
So here, I'm going to give these out. We have these, this is a company, that's, they specialize in library and archive supplies, and they have that little brochure, and it has both, obviously they're trying to sell you something, but it has pretty good information about how to do basic repairs and, storage and things like that. And then you can go to their website and see. I have other websites on the handout for places to buy supplies. But yeah, for photos, one thing I didn't mention when I was talking about unrolling things is if you have a rolled photo, you don't want to unroll that yourself. That's a big no-no. Unless it's completely fine. If it has a little bit of, if you can unroll it and it's,
If it's not brittle.
if it's not brittle, yeah, you can unroll it fine. If it's brittle, that's something that a conservator has to deal with. And from what I understand, it's not that hard for them usually. When I was at Library of Congress, I worked for the Veterans History Project, and a lot of people would send in their regimental photos, and they're all these panoramic photos, and they'd all be round up, and the conservator would come, and she'd love them because she used them for intern projects. So I don't think it's that big of a deal if someone knows what they're doing, but you do need special equipment and expertise to unroll a photo. Whereas paper is a lot more forgiving because it's a lot easier to crack the emulsion and then you can repair it on a photo. So yeah, the folders definitely come in all sorts of sizes. They come in letter and legal sizes. The boxes come in letter and legal sizes. You can also use record storage cartons that are acid-free if you want. Generally, I think libraries and archives use these because it's easier to pull. They're lighter and they're easier to pull for reference. But they do tip over in a very annoying way if you've ever dealt with them. So you could absolutely buy larger boxes if you wanted. There's nothing wrong with having
Make sure they're.
Right, yeah, but they absolutely sell those sorts of boxes, and they sell folders in all sorts of sizes. You can also buy a larger folder and cut it down if you had to. But yeah, and you can get boxes also like those newspaper boxes, like if your photo was like the size of like a broadsheet or something like that, you could, buy a newspaper box and use it, like, that's fine, you know, you don't have to put newspapers in the newspaper box, you can mix it up, yeah.
Thank you.
So for storing these items in the home, what would be your best, like, advice to where would you put it in your house?
Yeah, that's a good question. Because, I have a gigantic bin of photos in my attic. It's in this awful off-gassing plastic bin, from when my mom died, and I just like threw everything in a box and threw it up there, which I think is what a lot of us do. I think if you have like maybe like a home office or something like that, you want it to be in a place where, it's gonna be this like livable temperature. It's not necessarily gonna be pretty to display, because it's like storage, so, you could put it in a closet or something like that, that's fine. You kind of want some airflow, but, in your house, what are you gonna do? You're not gonna have like open shelving, on display with your boxes, it's just not, it's not pretty. So I think as long as you, like I said, avoid a place where there's a chance of leaks, you can keep it off the floor, it's gonna be a constant temperature. Although I think it's really a home decor issue, more than anything else, Yeah.
You mentioned how to store documents, but is there a best method for storing photographs?
Yeah, you can store photographs in the boxes, for sure. Generally, if you're gonna sleeve them, you can sleeve them and put them in folders, and put the folders in the boxes. You can bunch them in envelopes, and again, these are like acid-free envelopes for photos, and put the envelopes in the photos. If you have a whole bunch of photos, or they're all like the same size, or like postcards, or things like that, they make boxes that are specific for that. You can look for postcard size, boxes that are, exactly like that. You can also, like I said, put them in the Mylar sleeves and put them in albums. You can buy the albums and the sleeves, and then you can kind of have like a album. It's not maybe as pretty as like a scrapbook or whatever, but it's, protected. You can flip through it. You're not like touching everything. So there are definitely options, but it's basically the same. You don't necessarily have to store your photos separate, you don't have to be in like cold storage or in a freezer or anything like that. If you have negatives, you can store your negatives. You should probably store your negatives in paper. They do make plastic sleeves for negatives. You definitely don't want to, if you have nitrate negatives, you definitely don't want to store those in plastic, but acetate also is better in paper sleeve if you have those. Nitrate is also, could be flammable, so that's a concern if you have like very old negatives. I don't know which one to do about that, it's a big problem. And the same thing with glass, they make, if you have like glass negatives, or, I don't know if people have electric slides at home, but, things like that, they make special boxes for that. And if you go to this website, or like, who else do I have in here, University Products, or Hollander, or Light Impressions, any of these companies, they have a lot of different supplies, for all sorts of different things. And even as archival methods, they sell supplies too, and you can look on there. But yeah, you can absolutely put them in the regular boxes. You don't need some sort of special photographic setup or anything like that.
Is it bad to have them in an album, or
It depends.
is there like special sleeves?
It's not necessarily bad to have it in an album. These, like, if you have any, like, these sorts of albums, if you have any of these, like, from this era, like, everyone I've seen that, these sorts of albums are, like, they look great. Like, the pages are fine, the photos look good, and, these are also black and white photos, so they don't, like, fade as much. And for something like that, I would just get a box for it and just put it in there and, sort of be careful when I'm taking it out. But, preservation is like a balance between, use and, preservation, and there's no point in preserving it if you're never gonna be able to look at it or touch it or anything like that. So you wanna be able to take your albums out and show them to people, but you don't necessarily want people like pawing at them and, so, just be mindful of that. But if the album is in great condition and photos look fine, then there's nothing wrong with that. I think, like I said, a box would be like the absolute best thing. But, if it's doing okay on the shelf, that's fine, Good? Okay. All right, thank you.